This is how alliances start to crack. In the space of 48 hours, one of America's closest allies was no longer spoken to like a partner, but like a problem to be controlled. The contradiction is hard to miss. Publicly, this is framed as trade. Privately, it sounds a lot more like pressure. And if you think this is just noise between Washington and Ottawa, that assumption is risky. Donald Trump publicly warned that if Canada deepens trade ties with China, the United States could impose 100% tariffs and even suggested Canada could lose ice hockey. He later threatened a 50% tariff on Canadian-made aircraft, including Bombardier jets, in a written social media post. When cultural symbols, defense systems, and tariffs are all invoked at once, this isn't casual rhetoric. It's leverage. If a country as economically integrated and militarily aligned as Canada can be talked to this way, the question isn't what happens to them, it's what this model gets used for next. Because here's where the story quietly shifts. Some of the pressure isn't about trade at all, it's about sovereignty. And once that line is tested, it rarely gets untested. At first glance, this looks like a messy trade dispute spiraling out of control. Tariffs threatened, deals questioned, offhand remarks that sound unserious. But that framing misses what's actually happening. This isn't one argument. It's a pattern forming in real time. Over the same 48-hour period, Trump warned Canada against a major trade pact with China, threatened 100% tariffs after previously signaling approval, and added a separate 50% tariff threat targeting Canadian aircraft and Bombardier equipment. All of this unfolded while Canadian officials were publicly reaffirming alliance commitments. When positions reverse this fast, the goal isn't consistency, it's uncertainty. Now, notice the pattern. Trade pressure isn't applied alone. It's paired with cultural language, defense language, and public humiliation. Ice hockey isn't about sport. Aircraft aren't just about planes. These are pressure points designed to signal who sets the terms. And here's the reframing question that matters. If this were really just about economics, why widen the battlefield? Because this moment isn't isolated. It fits a broader shift where alliances are treated as conditional and loyalty is tested publicly. And that leads directly to what escalates next. Not in theory, but on record. The strongest claim so far is this: the pressure on Canada is no longer symbolic. It's operational. According to the transcript, the U.S. ambassador to Canada warned that if Canada does not purchase American-made F-35 fighter jets, the United States could withdraw from NORAD defense agreements. The same warning included that U.S. F-35s could fly over Canadian territory whenever it wants if Canada refuses the purchase. That detail matters. NORAD isn't a talking point. It's the backbone of North American air defense. And fighter jets flying whenever they want isn't diplomacy. It's dominance language. When defense cooperation is reframed as conditional obedience, the alliance has already shifted. Now notice what wasn't denied. There was no clarification walking this back. No assurance that defense commitments are independent of procurement decisions. Silence filled the gap. And that silence lands at the same time Canada announces a review of future U.S. military purchases, including the F-35, citing what happened to Denmark, a country that bought the jets and became dependent on U.S.-controlled maintenance and systems. This is where the story flips. What sounds like a procurement dispute is actually about dependency, about who can turn systems on and who can shut them off. And once that vulnerability is exposed, the pressure doesn't stop at jets. Once that dependency is exposed, escalation becomes easier and faster. Canada began reviewing alternatives to U.S. fighter jets, including Sweden's Saab Gripen, partly because those aircraft can be built and maintained domestically, reducing reliance on U.S.-controlled systems. This review followed public warnings tied directly to defense cooperation. That's the moment this stops being theoretical. Because historically, pressure like this doesn't stay at the level of contracts. It expands. During the Cold War, defense hardware was leverage. During the war on terror, basing rights were leverage. The mechanism is the same: control the system, control the choices. When military interoperability is treated as a reward instead of a constant, it normalizes coercion inside alliances. Now watch how quickly the abnormal becomes normal. A threat to pull out of NORAD, the idea of military aircraft being used to signal compliance. These are things that would have been unthinkable as casual talking points until they weren't. And here's the part that should slow you down. None of this is framed as punishment. It's framed as consequence, as if this is simply how the world works now. That's how escalation hides, not in explosions, but in acceptance. And that sets the stage for something far more destabilizing than trade or jets. The second proof is where the story turns disturbing. According to multiple statements in the transcript, members of the Trump administration were accused of engaging in surreptitious conversations with fringe separatist groups in Alberta. This allegation was raised publicly at a First Minister's meeting in Ottawa and addressed directly by Prime Minister Mark Carney when asked by the press. Carney's response was measured but sharp. He said he expects the U.S. administration to respect Canadian sovereignty and made clear that this line had been communicated directly to President Trump. He refused to offer a running commentary, but he did not deny the seriousness of the issue. Then the tone changed. British Columbia Premier David Eby went further, calling efforts to solicit a foreign government to break up Canada treasonous activity, adding that it needs to be called out and needs to be stopped. Ontario Premier Doug Ford said such actions were unacceptable, unethical, and that Canada must fight back with every tool we have. Here's the contradiction that changes how you see this. Publicly, U.S. officials talk about trade and defense, but at the same time, Canadian leaders are responding to what they describe as attempts to fracture the country itself. When economic pressure and internal destabilization appear together, this stops being negotiation. It becomes strategy. And once that door opens, the situation accelerates fast. What follows is the moment control starts slipping. In rapid succession, three things happened. Trump publicly added a new threat, a 50% tariff on Canadian aircraft, explicitly naming Bombardier. He posted that Canada would be decertified until U.S.-made Gulfstream jets were approved. At the same time, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent appeared on right-wing media suggesting Alberta could be a natural partner for the United States and hinted at a possible referendum on leaving Canada. Almost simultaneously, Bessent claimed Prime Minister Carney had walked back his Davos remarks, a claim Carney publicly called a lie. None of these were walked back. When pressure stacks this fast, economic, political, informational, it signals urgency, not confidence. Notice the speed: tariffs, decertification, secession talk, narrative warfare. This isn't a slow diplomatic dispute. It's a pile-on. Each move increases noise, forces reaction, and narrows Canada's room to maneuver. And here's the destabilizing part. These actions don't require follow-through to work. The threat alone forces markets, governments, and people to start calculating risk. What happens if defense systems can be shut off? What happens if internal divisions are amplified? What happens if every response triggers another escalation? Because once momentum replaces intention, events start driving leaders, not the other way around. What happens if this continues? This is the point where it stops being abstract and starts landing in everyday life. Canadian leaders repeatedly framed the situation as a direct threat to national unity and sovereignty, not just a political dispute. Premier David Eby spoke about families, immigrants, and First Nations who helped to build the country, saying Canada is something people have to fight for. Premier Ford warned that uncertainty and division weaken the country at the exact moment pressure is coming from outside. Now, put yourself in that position. When defense agreements are questioned, jobs tied to aerospace, manufacturing, and energy don't feel secure. When tariffs are threatened overnight, prices don't wait for clarity. When talk of secession appears on television, it doesn't stay theoretical. It seeps into conversations, markets, and confidence. You don't need borders to move for people to feel destabilized. You just need doubt. This is why Canadian premiers kept returning to the same word, unity, not as a slogan, but as damage control. Because once people start wondering whether alliances, contracts, or even borders are negotiable, behavior changes fast. And here's the quiet interaction happening with the viewer. If you've ever watched a political fight and felt the ground shift beneath normal life, work, prices, security, this will feel familiar. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because the real question isn't whether Canada can absorb this pressure. It's why the system allows this kind of pressure to be applied at all. To understand why this is even possible, you have to look past personalities and focus on the mechanism. Every pressure point raised so far, tariffs, defense systems, aircraft certification, even public rhetoric, runs through one channel: control over access, access to markets, access to maintenance, access to security frameworks, access to legitimacy. Power here isn't exercised through force, it's exercised through dependency. Modern alliances are built on interlocking systems, shared defense platforms, integrated supply chains, harmonized certification rules. They're efficient when trust exists. But when trust erodes, those same systems become leverage. The more integrated the system, the more pressure can be applied without firing a shot. This is why the threats don't need to be coherent. They just need to be credible enough to introduce risk. Once risk appears, behavior changes automatically. Governments hedge, companies pause, people adjust expectations. And here's the unsettling insight mainstream coverage often misses. This isn't chaos, it's theater with incentives. Loud statements create spectacle. Spectacle forces reaction. Reaction creates negotiation under pressure. That's why the tone matters less than the structure. The structure rewards whoever is willing to inject uncertainty fastest. And once that tactic proves effective inside one alliance, it doesn't stay contained. It gets reused. Which brings us to where this is likely heading next. Not as certainty, but as trajectory. From here, the trajectory splits, and neither path is clean. Canada has publicly committed to building new partnerships abroad, strengthening domestic capacity, and responding to U.S. pressure positively, while also drawing a clear line on sovereignty. At the same time, the U.S. administration has not withdrawn its tariff threats, its defense warnings, or the rhetoric around internal Canadian divisions. That creates two possible paths. The first path is stabilization through resistance. Canada absorbs short-term pain, diversifies defense and trade, and proves that pressure tactics carry costs. In that scenario, the threats lose effectiveness because they no longer control behavior. The alliance survives, but it changes, colder, more transactional, less automatic. The second path is drift. Pressure doesn't need to break Canada outright. It just needs to fragment responses. Delays, internal arguments, market hesitation. Once enough friction builds, leverage increases without another word being said. Notice what makes this moment fragile. Both paths are already forming. Decisions on fighter jets, trade routes to Asia, public unity among premiers. None of these are symbolic. They're directional. And here's the key uncertainty. If the next escalation comes quickly, before alternatives are fully built, momentum favors pressure. If it stalls, momentum flips. That means the next move doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to arrive before the system adapts. And that decision point is closer than it looks. There's one insight that reframes everything you've just seen. This wasn't a trade fight that turned political. It was a test of how far leverage can go before it's named for what it is. Tariffs, jets, certification, even talk of internal division. None of these were random. They were probes. Each one checked a boundary. Each one measured response. Canadian leaders consistently returned to a single non-negotiable point: sovereignty. Prime Minister Carney called it a bright line. Multiple premiers said unity was essential precisely because external pressure was increasing, not decreasing. When sovereignty has to be restated this often, it's because something is trying to make it conditional. Here's the loop to close on. If this model works, applying pressure inside alliances without formal rupture, it becomes reusable. Not just against Canada, against any country integrated deeply enough to be vulnerable. And that's why this story doesn't end with a tariff decision or a fighter jet contract. It ends with a question about the future of alliances themselves. Are they mutual commitments or temporary arrangements enforceable by leverage? The next chapter of this story won't announce itself. It will look procedural, technical, boring, until suddenly it isn't. If you want clear-eyed analysis as this continues to unfold, follow and subscribe. Because the most important shifts rarely arrive loudly, they arrive quietly and then all at once.